Hi, everyone. I think I'm going to get started now. I'm Susan Goldhaber, a member of the Program Committee of Voice4Israel. Voice4Israel was established 11 years ago with the mission to advocate and educate for Israel, and we are delighted to be able to bring to you today's distinguished speaker, Mark Dubowitz. We first wish to acknowledge our partners for today's webinar, Jewish for Good, and the Raleigh-Cary Jewish Community Relations Council. Thank you so much. I also want to tell you about some upcoming exciting events. On January 10th at 7:30 p.m., Voice4Israel will be hosting a Zoom webinar with Dov Wilker, the Atlanta American Jewish Community Committee Regional Director. He will be discussing the groundbreaking results of the AJC survey on American attitudes toward anti-Semitism. On February 7th at 2 p.m., we will be having our first Voice4Israel afternoon at the movies. We will be showing The Syrian Patient. We will include links for these events in our follow-up email to all attendees of tonight's program. If you would like to receive our Voice4Israel emails to be updated about our programming and issues related to Israel and the Jewish people, please sign up at our website, voice4israel.com. I am so excited about tonight's event. We will be having a conversation with Mark Dubowitz, the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the FDD, which is a Washington, D.C.-based nonpartisan policy institute. We really want to thank the FDD for allowing us to tap into its brain power and hold this amazing event. My husband and I have recently become members of the FDD and have been so impressed with the quality of their work. Mark is a very sought-after guest speaker, and we are so fortunate and delighted to have him with us tonight. The format for this event will consist of a short introduction, then Mike Ross, the co-founder and chairman of Voice4Israel, will have a conversation with Mark for about a half an hour, and then I will moderate a question and answer period for the remaining time. If you have a question, please type it in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now for the introduction. As I said before, Mark Dubowitz is the Chief Executive at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, the FDD. Mark is an expert on Iran's nuclear program and global threat network, and is widely recognized as one of the key influencers in shaping policies to counter the threats from the regime in Iran. He also contributes to FDD's China program, drawing on his academic background in China studies and his private sector work in the Indo-Pacific. Mark has advised the Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and testified more than 20 times before the US Congress and foreign legislatures. He is the author or co-author of dozens of studies on economic sanctions and Iran's nuclear program, and is widely published and cited in US and international media. According to the New York Times, Mark Dubowitz's campaign to draw attention to what he saw as flaws in the Iran nuclear deal has taken its place among the most consequential ever undertaken by a Washington think tank leader. According to a former US official quoted by BuzzFeed, if you want to know what's going to happen next in Iran policy, there's a pretty good bet that it's whatever has been in the latest Mark Dubowitz or FDD op-ed. So now I'd like to turn to Mike Ross and Mark Dubowitz.
Thank you, Susan. Sorry about that. Thank you for the introduction. I want to thank Mark for agreeing to appear tonight. I want to welcome you to our webinar and say it is such a pleasure to speak with you today. This is a rare opportunity for me and for our audience to hear from a renowned expert in Middle Eastern affairs and one of the most influential think tank leaders in the world regarding how to thwart Iranian nuclear weapons ambitions. So much has happened in the past 6 months in the Middle East, and there's so much to talk about, and I want to get right to it. So let's jump right in with the issue of Iran. We are all aware of the need to combat the Iranian nuclear program. I think it is important to put it in the context of the broader agenda of the regime and their destabilizing activities, which pose such a challenge to our interests and those of Israel. Mark, can you please outline some of the scope of the activities that Iran's been up to?
Sure, Mike, and thanks so much to you and to Susan and Marcia and to Stanley and to all of you for everything you do in defense of the United States and Israel and the important U.S.-Israel relationship. So yeah, I've spent 17 years working on Iran. Last summer for the benefit of all that work, I was sanctioned by the Islamic Republic and threatened by the Islamic Republic Revolutionary Guard Corps and their intelligence agencies. And it just it sort of underscores that this is a regime that is dangerous, destructive, and that sees conspiracies in everything. I mean, so, they're locked in mortal combat with the United States, a global superpower with hundreds of billions of dollars to spend on defense and intelligence. And yet they've gone after me and my think tank, a 60-person think tank in Washington. And it gives you some insight into the mindset of the mullahs. And I think everybody in this Zoom call knows for over 40 years, the regime in Iran has engaged in destructive activities abroad, supporting terrorism, missile proliferation, developing ballistic missiles, obviously developing a nuclear weapons program, and also engaged in brutal repression at home, murdering and maiming tens of thousands of Iranians in order to keep this brutal regime in power. So it is one of the most severe threats to the state of Israel. It's certainly an existential threat, but it's also a strategic threat to the United States. And that's why it's commanded so much attention from so many administrations over the past 4 decades.
So I was listening to a professor at NC State locally, and he was saying that there are 2 schools of thought about Iranian activity. And I was surprised that he would say this, but he said that Iran, some people think it's after hegemony, it's got an ideologic motivation, and other people say that really all it's doing is trying to create a defensive perimeter around itself, which kind of struck me as very naive. Is there any credence to, what would you say to that?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't know who the professor is, but he clearly doesn't understand much about the revolutionary nature of this regime. I mean, it's in this regime's constitution that it has created a revolutionary movement, the goal of which is to spread and inculcate this ideology beyond its borders, even beyond the Middle East, around the world, into Asia, into Latin America, certainly even into North America. And they have a very well-funded both propaganda and proselytizing arm to do exactly that. The second thing is, if that's true, that they only want to create a defensive perimeter around their borders, then what's their beef with Israel? I mean, Israel and Iran don't share a border, but what they've actually done is they've actually surrounded Israel with hundreds of thousands of missiles in Lebanon, in Gaza, in Syria, and certainly trying to create a precision-guided missile threat that could really inflict tens of thousands of civilian casualties and go after the infrastructure of Israel in order to ultimately, as Khamenei, the supreme leader, said, in order to destroy the Jewish state. So if this is only a kind of defensive military doctrine to protect its borders, how do you explain the revolutionary nature of the regime, 4 decades of revolutionary activity, and certainly this obsession with the Jewish state and it's this objective of trying to destroy Israel on every border?
Okay, so now I want to turn to the so-called Iran deal known as the JCPOA. Can you briefly set out for our audience what you and many others see as the major deficiencies of the original Iran nuclear deal agreed upon in 2015?
So the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or as you say, the JCPOA, reached in 2015, was meant to permanently cut off Iran's pathways to nuclear weapons, or at least that's the way it was billed by the Obama administration. Of course, if you read the agreement, and I have many times, it's a long agreement, very detailed. What's clear from the agreement is that the restrictions on Iran's nuclear program actually are set to disappear over time. They're set to sunset. It's built into the agreement that the most important restrictions on Iran's enrichment capability, plutonium reprocessing capability, ability to build enrichment plants, ability to use advanced centrifuges, and many other restrictions, including its ability to develop a ballistic missile program. All of those restrictions are set to expire within 5 to 15 years from 2015. So we're already actually into the first sunset. The conventional arms embargo just expired in October, which allows Iran now to shop around the world for advanced weaponry and buy itself fighter jets and battle tanks and advanced missiles and attack helicopters, so it can build up a massive conventional army. That UN embargo expired in October. In 2023, the UN missile embargo is set to sunset. As well in 2023, Iran, which has been able to work on advanced centrifuges from day one, will have the ability to install and operate a much greater number of advanced centrifuges because that restriction sunsets in 2023. And Mike, just to understand what that actually means, why would you want advanced centrifuges if you're Iran? Well, the reason is those advanced centrifuges are far more efficient at enriching uranium to weapons grade in order to build nuclear weapons. And therefore you need far fewer number, and therefore they're much easier to hide. So Iran's problem over the years is it's used these first generation centrifuges, the design of which it got from AQ Khan from Pakistan, but to build up an enrichment capability, it had to have 20,000 centrifuges. Now that's obviously much easier for Western intelligence agencies to detect, which they did. And so now what Iran wants to do is take 20,000 down to 1,000 advanced centrifuges and then bury that in under a mountain on a Revolutionary Guard base to build a clandestine enrichment facility. So if you look at the deal itself, instead of permanently cutting off all pathways to nuclear weapons, it's given Iran a patient pathway to nuclear weapons. All the Iranians have to do is comply with the deal for at least a decade, build up this industrial size enrichment capability with near zero nuclear breakout, a easier clandestine sneak out, ballistic missiles that can carry warheads, and obviously benefit from the hundreds of billions of dollars in sanctions relief that the JCPOA promises in order to build up its economy, its regional dominance, and emerge at this lethal end state when it'll have the ability to build multiple nuclear weapons, attach those to missiles, threaten Israel and the United States and our other allies, and also use the money to immunize itself against our ability to use peaceful economic pressure in the future. That's the JCPOA in a nutshell. And that's why I've said it always contains fatal flaws that need to be fixed and need to be fixed fast.
I'm speaking for the people that I've spoken to who support the deal and will say that there are intrusive there's an inspection regime as part of the JCPOA that prevents Iran from cheating, and that there's been no evidence of substantial cheating in that regard. How would you respond to that assertion?
Well, first of all, the inspection regime right now is in Iran's known facilities. And that's true. There are IAE inspectors there 24/7 monitoring Natanz and Fordo, which are Iran's two main enrichment facilities, and Arak, which is Iran's heavy water reactor, which can be used for plutonium reprocessing. And that is true. Right now, those inspectors are there. The problem, of course, is, as I've noted, Iran can start to industrialize the size of its program over time by building multiple enrichment facilities, multiple heavy water reactors in a country that is twice the size of Texas. Now, the problem, of course, is how do you actually monitor a country and a nuclear program that big? Right now, the facilities are fairly small, easy to monitor. When Iran has a massive program like that, right, at that point, when Iran is ready to dash to a bomb or sneak out to a bomb, Iran can either try evade the inspectors or could do what North Korea did, which is throw out the inspectors and take the chance that at that point, no one will stop them because they'll be so close to multiple nuclear weapons, no country will resist that. The second argument I would use in opposition to that position is Iran has been massively cheating. What they've been massively cheating on is not necessarily the JCPOA. They've been massively cheating on their even more important obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And there, what they've done is they haven't declared all their nuclear materials and nuclear facilities to the IAEA. In fact, there are 3 sites that the IAEA today is trying to get into, and Iran refuses to allow inspectors into. And of course, that was always the problem with this inspection regime, is that Iran would let you into facilities that they want you to see and would not let you into facilities that they don't want you to see. And of course, those facilities that they don't want you to see will be on Revolutionary Guard military bases. They'll be buried under a mountain. They'll be, hidden away from the IAEA. And Iran will continue to push back against any attempt to allow inspectors into those facilities. And that's exactly what's happening. Iran is in flagrant violation of its NPT obligations right now. And the IAEA, under the IAEA Secretary General, Rafael Grossi, is trying to get into these facilities. And we're only a few years into the JCPOA, never mind what's going to happen in 10 years when Iran's got massive facilities that it's been legally able to build under this flawed agreement.
So under the agreement, as I understand it, and I may not phrase it, but Iran said that it no longer has nuclear weapons ambitions, essentially, and they promised they're not going to build a nuclear weapons program. But they didn't have to, as part of the agreement, one would think that they would have had to have come clean on their program in the past. And apparently they didn't. They didn't have to, or they didn't do it, or the IAEA signed off on it. And then a few years ago, Israel, with this remarkable operation, was able to take out the archives on their weapons program. What's the significance of what the Israelis found, and does that actually in some way discredit the whole idea of the deal, or not?
So Mike, you're exactly right. So in 2015, Iran was not required to come clean on its so-called past military nuclear activities, weaponization activities. It was sort of, they waved it away. John Kerry said, we know everything we need to know. The IAEA closed the file on Iran's, the possible military dimensions, the PMDs as they call it in a euphemistic way, which is essentially Iran's atomic weapons program. And then the Mossad, and as you say, a daring operation, snuck into Iran, pulled out this massive nuclear archive, took it back to Mossad headquarters. I've had the honor of being able to see it and be briefed on part of it. And what it demonstrates is that Iran had a formal, systematic weapons development program until 2003. And with the goal of making, at the time, 5 nuclear warheads. Well, in 2003, you remember the United States invaded Iraq, disposed of Saddam Hussein, Iran's mortal enemy, in a matter of a few weeks, and Iran got scared. So what did they do? Did they end the nuclear weapons program? They did not. What they did is they actually split it into a public, overt, so-called civilian nuclear program, which is where all the enrichment activities are taking place now under the guise of a civilian nuclear program, and a private, informal, covert program, which they put under the leadership of a guy named Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. I'm sure you've now, in recent weeks, learned that name. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh is the grandfather of Iran's nuclear weapons program. He, for decades, has been leading Iran's attempt to build nuclear warheads. And Fakhrizadeh, who was engaged in clandestine efforts before 2003, continued those clandestine efforts under something called SPND, which is a Persian acronym for Iran's military nuclear program under the auspices of the Iranian Ministry of Defense. So from 2003 until a few weeks ago, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was the head of Iran's military nuclear program, with research and development activities taking place in universities and research labs, in front companies controlled by the Ministry of Defense, none of which had been disclosed to the IAEA, none of which was required to be disclosed by the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Now, we all know what happened to Mohsen Fakhrizadeh in another daring Mossad operation, reportedly Mossad operation. Fakhrizadeh was taken out and eliminated. And obviously there was a big media storm around this. And we learned even more as the reporting came out about who was Mohsen Fakhrizadeh and what has he been doing for the past few decades. And what we learned definitively is Mohsen Fakhrizadeh has not abandoned his efforts to develop nuclear weapons.
All right. There's so much to talk about. I want to get to the Abraham Accords. And I just want to say I was going to bring up Fakhrizadeh's name, and I was practicing how to pronounce it all day. So you took my thunder away. But you are famously such a proponent and really have been setting the agenda for the maximum pressure campaign of crippling sanctions. I know you could go on and on about that, but how do you see their effectiveness? What's been the result? The naysayers will say that it's forced Iran to do bad things, that it's enriched more, but I know that that Iran is now reeling from the sanctions. So what's your perspective on that?
Look, I think the maximum pressure campaign has been very successful, but it depends what you define as its objective. Now, the Trump administration had said publicly that its objective was to drive Iran back to the table to negotiate a new agreement that addresses the full range of Iran's malign and illicit activities. Well, Iran is not back yet at the table, but I would point out to the naysayers that it took Barack Obama 4 years to get, almost 5 years actually, to get Iran back to the table to negotiate the interim agreement in 2013, and another 2 years to get the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So it took Barack Obama about 6 years to get an agreement, right? So we're 2.5 years into the maximum pressure campaign. Iran is not back at the table, but obviously Iran, I think, would have come back to the table had Trump been reelected, because they could not have withstood 4 more years of maximum pressure. There was no way. They also didn't come back to the table because they assumed that, and quite rightly so now, that Trump would be a one-term president. And so they didn't have to come back to the table because they had heard from Democratic contenders for president, including Joe Biden, that if the Democrats were to win, they would take America back into the JCPOA, they'd lift the most powerful sanctions, and hundreds of billions of dollars would flow into the coffers of the mullahs. So if you're Iran, why would you come back to the table under Trump? You would wait, and that's exactly what they did. Actually, at the advice of former Obama administration officials like John Kerry, who said to the Iranians, just wait. No need to do anything. When we're back in office, we'll go back into the JCPOA and lift the sanctions. But one has to look at Iran today compared to 4 years ago. Right? Iran is facing a severe economic crisis. Iran is facing a severe domestic political crisis as a result of these economic conditions, and as a result of the fact that the majority of Iranians despise this regime after 4 decades of repression and economic mismanagement. And how do we know that? We know that because hundreds of thousands of them have been on the streets for years. First since 2009, when millions were on the streets in Tehran during the Green Revolution. And in recent years, all over Iran and all of its provinces, hundreds of thousands have been braving brutal repression in order to make it clear to the mullahs that they want the mullahs gone. And to make it clear that they don't want the money being spent on Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Bashar Assad. And so that domestic political crisis is something that the regime faces as well. It also is now having to make this painful fundamental choice between guns for terrorists and butter for its people, and that classic kind of guns, butter, economic dichotomy. And it doesn't have the money to do both. And so it's facing a massive budgetary squeeze, a massive foreign exchange squeeze. It therefore has reduced transfer payments to Assad and Hezbollah and Hamas and PIJ. It doesn't have the money to support its allies in Iraq and in Lebanon. And those two countries are also facing severe economic and political crises, Mike, as you know. So plus, and I'll just conclude with this, it's lost its most effective battlefield commander when Qasem Soleimani was killed in January. Its most effective Iraq-based battlefield commander when al-Muhandis was killed along with Soleimani. And it just lost Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the head of its nuclear weapons program. Beyond that, sabotage of its nuclear facilities, its advanced centrifuge R&D facilities, its missile facilities. The Israelis have been running circles around them for 4 years. They're in a much, much weaker position than they were 4 years ago. Maximum pressure has been a success. And I hope that the Biden administration is wise enough to take all of the leverage created in the past 4 years and use it wisely to negotiate a new agreement rather than doing what I fear they're doing, is going back in, lifting the sanctions, flowing the money back, diminishing their leverage, and then wanting to negotiate an agreement with Iran to address the fatal flaws of the original agreement.
So let's shift gears and talk about the Abrahamic Accords, something that is really, truly breathtaking, extraordinary, game-changing. We now have UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco opening diplomatic ties with Israel, with the prospects for several countries to follow. Predictions are that Oman and Indonesia may be next. Can you share your perspective of the impact of these accords and the short and long-term effects of accords on the Middle East?
Look, I think it's been profound, because you talk about normalization, you assume exchange of diplomats, you assume a formal public recognition, all of the sort of political niceties that go into normalization. But what you're seeing is far beyond that. It's an extraordinary embrace, particularly between the Emiratis and the Israelis. I mean, I saw just a statistic today about the tens of thousands of Israelis that are already in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, have gone there for Hanukkah. The Emiratis who are coming now, celebrating Shabbat and Hanukkah in Jerusalem. The high tech exchanges, the venture capitalists. I mean, it's remarkable how quickly this thing has gone from the signing on the South Lawn, and I was, very, very privileged to be there in September, and now this full embrace of normalization, and now it's being extended obviously to Bahrain, to Sudan, to Morocco, and as you hinted at, many more countries to come, including, I believe, Saudi Arabia at the appropriate time. This effectively means that this is the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I think we're all old enough, I assume on the Zoom call, to remember the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? And how devastating a conflict that was. By the way, if you haven't had the opportunity to see this incredible HBO Max series called The Valley of Tears about the Yom Kippur War, please watch it. It is a brilliant series and a stark reminder of the brutality of the Arab-Israeli wars and the tremendous losses in blood and treasure on both sides. That conflict's over. And with the exception of Syria and Lebanon and, Iraq to some extent, kind of holdout countries, the rest of the Arab world has either embraced Israel or soon will embrace Israel. Now, Mike, why is this all happening? It's all happening because for the years that I've spent traveling to the Gulf, speaking to the Saudis, Emiratis, Bahrainis, Omanis, all I've heard from them repeatedly for years is we're sick of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're sick of Palestinian rejectionism. We've put a huge amount of capital and political support behind the Palestinians. They don't know how to say yes when they're given multiple offers. And by the way, they're now saying this publicly, right? This is not just what they said to me privately. Now, senior former Saudi ambassadors and heads of intelligence and Emiratis are coming out and saying all these things publicly. They've said all these things to me privately. And finally, the thing they said to me is their priority is the threat from Iran. And they understand that while the United States may be hightailing out of the Middle East to go take China on in the Indo-Pacific, that the only country that is staying in the Middle East and is not going anywhere and has the capabilities to take on Iran is Israel. And they know the IDF and the Mossad have incredible capabilities in that respect. They need that. And they also want to start building a much more prosperous future for their young people. 3/4 of their population is under the age of 35. They can't support a population like that only on oil and natural gas. And they need to start building a much freer, more prosperous private sector. And they are in awe of Israel's startup nation. And they want to figure out ways to replicate that and benefit from that.
I was listening to a podcast with a colleague of yours at the FDD, Richard Goldberg, and he quoted an Arab official who kind of succinctly said it to him. He said, quote, "Israel is the future, the Palestinians are the past." And I think that in that short statement, it replicates what you were just saying. So but that's a bridge to my next question. How are the Palestinians are very upset about this, but do you think this will this will be an incentive for them to change their direction and to see the benefit of actually coming and accepting Israel's existence and making a peace.
Look, I hope so. I really hope so, for not only for the good of the Palestinians, but for the good of the Israelis. I think at the end of the day, that is a conflict that has to be settled in some fashion. But I think that the prevailing dogma about that for 40, 50, 60 years has been kind of an inside out assumption rather than an outside in. And what do I mean by that? I mean that the prevailing assumption amongst the foreign policy intelligentsia for decades in the United States and Europe and around the world is, first we solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then we normalize with the Arab world. And in fact, as John Kerry said it a few years ago, you can't. No Arab country will normalize with Israel until there's a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Well, John Kerry was wrong, right? Because that's the opposite of what's happening. In fact, Arabs are now normalizing with Israel. They're not waiting for the Palestinians to get their act together. And they're hoping that as the Israelis are embraced by the Arab world, feel more confident in the Middle East, more secure in the Middle East, they'll be willing to, quote unquote, take risks for peace. But they're also hoping that a new generation of Palestinians emerges that understands that they will no longer be coddled by these Arab countries. They will no longer be infantilized in the sense that they will not be held accountable for the decisions they made. And they hopefully will begin to understand that they too need to normalize with their Israeli neighbors, or there will never be a Palestinian state, and the status quo will probably remain without much resistance from any of these other Arab countries. So time is not on the side of Palestinians, and I think there is now a recognition that this outside-in strategy is more likely to bring Israelis and Palestinians back to the negotiating table, just to start to talk about, if not peace, to talk about normalization.
So I want to leave time for Q&A. I must ask you, before I leave you to the audience, we're now beyond the election and well into the transition into the Biden administration. How do you see his foreign policy team shaping up? And what changes do you foresee generally regarding U.S. policy in the Middle East under his administration? And if you can, let us know some of the dialogue you may or may not be having with them. I don't know whether you can or not.
Yeah, I know I'm in close touch with them. I've known many of them for many years. I think Joe Biden's initial selection of Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor and Tony Blinken as Secretary of State have been outstanding selections. I know Jake and Tony well. They're both tremendous individuals, public servants, and they're also intellectually curious. So that's really important. They don't come in with a very dogmatic approach to foreign policy, national security, and they will reach out to both supporters and critics equally to make them smarter about foreign policy. So those are great selections. I think the Secretary of Defense, General Austin, is a a good selection. I don't know General Austin well, only by reputation. I like the fact that he was commander of CENTCOM, right? So his responsibility was the Middle East. He has seen up close the malign and destructive influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think that'll be useful for the cabinet to have somebody sitting there who is not only and obsessively focused on China, like everybody else in the cabinet. Mm. Now, don't get me wrong, as somebody who works on China and has worked on China for many, many years, that is America's strategic priority in the coming few decades. And you have seen already, and you will continue to see, a massive shift in US foreign policy, both resources and thinking towards the Indo-Pacific and to the threat from China. However, Iran remains a significant threat. The Middle East remains a critical area. And it'd be important to have people at the table who have served there, who understand that, and don't think that you can pivot out of the Middle East and leave the Middle East to China and Russia and all will be well and good. The rest of the appointments we'll wait to see. And many of the most important appointments will be people that the public will have never heard of, the public will not focus on. But I'm particularly interested to see who comes in the deputy secretary and assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary roles, because those are people who are going to be instrumental in both making and implementing policy. I have my favorites and I have my my less than favorites, and I'll be looking closely at those people, and obviously a number of them are going to have to get confirmed by the U.S. Senate. So there'll be an opportunity to voice our opinion through that process.
All right, I could go on. I would love to talk to you for hours, but I want to let our audience ask questions. Susan, can you rejoin us?
Yes. Hi.
I'm going to turn my video off right now.
Okay. So I've got a few questions here. The first one is first a statement and then a question. I'll read the statement. Was the only diplomatic campaign that has ever really succeeded in preventing an adversarial state from developing nuclear weapons that I could think of as Libya back in 2003. For his efforts, the regime was overthrown back in 2011. I'm sure the mullahs were paying attention. So my question really, is there any good deal that Iran would be willing to agree to in good faith?
Oh, you got to ask Iran. I think you're right. I think the Obama decision to dispose of Gaddafi at the time was an understandable decision. He was engaged in what would have been a massive slaughter of Libyan civilians. And so from a humanitarian perspective, there was obviously a lot of pressure on President Obama and his team to stop that. And when they disposed of Gaddafi, they got rid of a brutal dictator. But you're right. I mean, the lesson for other brutal dictators is you voluntarily give up your nuclear weapons, and 10 years or how many years later, you end up being disposed of. So that is a sobering lesson for the Iranians. However, what the Iranians have to realize is they ultimately have a fundamental choice between regime survival and building nuclear weapons. They're not going to get both. If they move to nuclear weapons in any kind of profound way, the United States and/or Israel will destroy those nuclear facilities, will impose even more severe economic pressure. They will be diplomatically isolated. And the millions of Iranians who truly want regime change, right, democratic regime change, pose the biggest threat to the mullahs. So if the mullahs are smart, the way to preserve the regime is negotiate an agreement with the United States, but a treaty that has broad bipartisan support, that gets the advice and consent of the Senate, and that is ratified. Because with that, there's much greater predictability that that's an agreement that the next president and the president after that will honor. The problem with the 2015 agreement, as we all know, is that it was an executive agreement. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't submitted to the Senate. It was opposed by every Republican in the House and Senate. And it was just a matter of time before a Republican president would take office and reverse the 2015 agreement. So I think that's another important lesson for Biden, and an important lesson for the Iranians, that any next agreement has got to have broad bipartisan support in the US Congress and in the US public for it to be an agreement that has some longevity. I know the Iranians have learned that lesson. We'll see if Joe Biden decides to submit a next agreement, if there is a next agreement, as a treaty.
Okay, great. I have a few more questions. Next one is, with Morocco in the Abraham Accords, look 5 years down the road and try to predict what the Middle East will look like.
Yeah, that's a losing proposition to predict what the Middle East will look like. Look, I think if the Biden administration, and I think they will, capitalizes on the progress under the Abraham Accords, then they have an opportunity to bring in many more Arab countries. And obviously the most important Arab country to bring in is Saudi Arabia. I've had extensive discussions with the Saudis over a number of years at the highest levels of their leadership. I believe they're keen to normalize with Israel. I think MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, is committed to that. But obviously he faces a older Saudi establishment, particularly his father, King Salman, who brings a very different perspective. is very much committed to the sort of Arab League position of, the Arab peace proposals of the early 2000s, which were very centered on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I think it'll be when King Salman passes away and MBS takes over as king, I think you're going to see a move to normalization and fairly quickly. I think it's in Saudi Arabia's best interest to do so, not only in the Middle East vis-a-vis Iran, also vis-a-vis, by the way, the Muslim Brotherhood and Turkey. We can talk about that because that's also part of the calculation about the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Bahrainis. But also because from a domestic point of view, the Saudis are potentially in a whole lot of trouble in the next 4 years. There's an element of the Democratic Party that sees Saudi Arabia as a much more severe threat to the United States than Iran. And then there's the kind of moderate wing of the party, demonstrated by, or exemplified by Joe Biden, who wants to recalculate, recharacterize the US-Saudi relationship. We don't know what that means, but it certainly doesn't mean good things for the Saudis. And I think there'll be a lot of focus on their human rights abuses, quite rightly so. A lot of focus on the war in Yemen, quite rightly so. The continued fallout from the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. And in order to minimize the negative political impact of what is going to transpire, the Saudis would be wise to normalize with Israel. I think that would create a very different context for them. And I know they know that, and they have that in mind. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see in a Biden first term, Saudi-Israeli normalization. So when I look forward 5 years, which is essentially towards the end of Joe Biden's first term or just after that, I truly do see the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I see a coalition of countries alongside Israel, countering the threat from Iran and radical Islam, and really opening up some pretty profound economic and cultural and person-to-person opportunities. I'm optimistic, but of course in the Middle East, optimism Middle East is a place where optimism goes to die.
They're coming on here now, finally. Great. Another question. Do you think that Joe Biden will seek to escape the dilemma by going to Congress for an attempt to get a treaty?
I think he should. I think it would be wise of him to do so. It would be wise of him to get Republican support on liftoff of their Iran policy so that Republicans will be there on landing. Otherwise, I think Joe Biden will receive a repeat of 2015, where Barack Obama was opposed, as I said, by every Republican and ended up in a major confrontation with Benjamin Netanyahu. I think what's different this time around is that Biden is better able to work with Republicans. So I'm hopeful that he will on Iran policy. I think he also is probably better able to work with Netanyahu and the Gulf states than Obama. And I think that will be very important, so that rather than getting into another major confrontation over this, he can work with the Israelis, where, as I said earlier, the Israelis can be the bad cop to the American good cop, and they can coordinate a strategy of marching divided and striking united against the Islamic Republic. I hope he does that, and he'd be wise, if he does get an agreement at that point, to submit it to Congress as a treaty so that it is an agreement that has more longevity, as I mentioned earlier.
Okay. The next is, the question is about the settlements. It's kind of like three in here. I'll read you the first one. And then it says, do you think Biden will ask Israel for a freeze on settlement construction in the way Obama did? That's the first one. So I guess I'll ask that first. And
so I don't know. I think it would be wise for him not to. Again, I think a Biden administration coming into office should seek to use the Abraham Accords, right, as a framework to restart Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. So rather than taking the old approach, which has failed miserably over decades, and that includes all of these ideas about settlement freezes and the like, is to say, listen, it's a new reality in the Middle East, right? Netanyahu agreed to suspend the recognition of Jewish sovereignty of the West Bank, or what some call annexation, in exchange for normalization with the UAE and Bahrain. And I think that's a good predicate to expand the ambit of what it means to have the Israelis and Palestinians come together. And people who spend a lot more time in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict than I do are going to have lots of ideas. I mean, I'm sure, my friend Dan Shapiro, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel under Obama, I hope he'll, find a good job in the Biden administration. Dan cares deeply about this issue. Dan is a very creative, smart guy who I think will bring a very important perspective to this. But I do hope that the kind of approach of old will be set aside to this new reality of dealing with the Israelis and Palestinians and bringing, Arab allies and bringing normalization as a framework to address this issue.
Okay, well, I think you probably addressed the second part of the question, but in your first answer, but the second part was, how do you see Israel's continued building of settlements outside of the main three blocks affecting the possibility of a viable Palestinian state? I don't know if you have anything to add to what you said in the first part.
Look, I think it's very important for Joe Biden to understand that the West Bank, that Judea and Samaria, is an integral part of Jewish identity, of Israeli history, right? This isn't just some throwaway land. I mean, this is land that's more important to the Jewish tradition, to Jewish history, to the Jewish religion than Herzliya or Tel Aviv or Ra'anana, right? So you've got to approach the Israelis that way. If you approach them that this is just a fait accompli, this is Palestinian land, this is where there'll be a Palestinian state, and you have no choice. And by the way, the concessions you give are not painful concessions. They're concessions that you must give. Then I think you're going to run right into the wall that American negotiators and diplomats have run into repeatedly. And by the way, that doesn't help Benjamin Netanyahu or any future Israeli prime minister deal with the reality that, at least half that country believes in the narrative that I just advanced, right? Which is not to say that ultimately Israel shouldn't give up that incredibly important territory, which is at the heart of the Jewish tradition. If there was a real peace, a serious peace, a sustainable peace, Israel would need to make those kinds of painful concessions. But there has to be a recognition of what I've said. These aren't just the territories. This is Judea and Samaria. And for, again, half the population, if not more, these are very painful concessions to give, especially to give on the assumption that somehow this will lead to a peaceful, democratic state living side by side with Israel, given the experience Israelis have had with the withdrawal from southern Lebanon, the withdrawal from Gaza, the continued radicalization of many in the Palestinian community, the continued incitement, the missile attacks, the terrorist attacks, not to mention the fact that Iran continues to try to stir up trouble and will stir up trouble with a new Palestinian state, creating a significant threat on Israel's eastern border to go along with the threats on every other border. So that's the context that I hope U.S. negotiators and U.S. diplomats will approach this obviously very, very difficult issue with.
I'm just going to take one more question. It says, while you express that time is not on the side of those Palestinians who wish to continue to reject Israel, it seems clear that the American public and younger Jews are less supportive of Israel. If we look at the current trends, is this as much of a concern to you as it is for others?
Look, I think it should be a concern. But maybe I'm too cynical after all these years of working on Middle East issues. I don't think necessarily that goes away if Israel agrees to a Palestinian state, because for it to go away, you have to assume that Palestinian state will be free and democratic, living in peace with Israel. If that's true, then yes, then I think young American Jews will say, great, that it all worked out for the best, just as we thought it would. But what happens if that Palestinian state is not free and democratic and living in peace with Israel? What happens if it is a failed state, a terrorist state, a state dominated by Iran, a state where Khamenei moves tens of thousands of missiles into the West Bank the way he has in southern Lebanon and Gaza and Syria? What happens if Israel has to do to the West Bank what Israel has had to do to Gaza, which is defend itself, right, by going in there to stop terrorist attacks, to stop missile launches, and has to go in there and use the IDF and the Israeli Air Force and the Shin Bet in order to prevent a very severe threat to the state of Israel from Palestine? Well, I can't imagine that you're going to see young American Jews of any generation, no matter when we are, supporting Israel's tactics in the West Bank, because they haven't supported Israel's tactics in Gaza, right? There's been widespread condemnation of Israeli tactics, despite the fact you all know Israel withdrew every soldier and every settler from Gaza, right? And now has had to deal with an onslaught of terrorist attacks through tunnels and missile attacks and fire balloon attacks on its border, threatening its the kibbutzim there and the villages that on the southern border. That's the problem. And so I want people sort of to understand that even though I sounded very optimistic about the Middle East earlier, right, things don't always work out the way we assume. And so this notion that you throw a Hail Mary pass, Israelis and Palestinians make peace, they live side by side, and Israeli and American Jews all of a sudden wake up and become Zionists again. Call me dubious, call me skeptical. I'd love to see it, but I'm not confident.
Okay, well, I said that was the last, but one really interesting question came in, and this will be it. It says, how do you see future internal politics unfolding, especially Bibi and Benny and all the rest? So I thought I'd end with that question.
Yeah. So the problem with Q&A always for speakers is you're an expert on Iran and broader normalization issues, and then you end up having to talk about the Palestinian cause and then worse, internal Israeli politics. So let me just state with a caveat, I am not an expert on internal Israeli politics. Look, what's clearly happened, at least from my amateurish perspective, is there is no left in Israel. Now, that doesn't mean the right is right. It just means there's no left. I mean, when you look at the Israeli political establishment today, right, there is a striking consensus on most of the major foreign policy and national security issues. They're fighting over small differences, whether it's Bibi or Bennett or Gantz or Lapid, or whether it is Gabi Ashkenazi or Yailon, or whether it's whoever else is coming. At the end of the day, there is a consensus, and I would say it's a consensus on the sort of central right with respect to Iran, the broader Middle East, normalization, the Palestinian issue, and the question of when would be the right time to negotiate with the Palestinians, under what conditions would you give up territory, how would you give up territory. There's some tactical differences in terms of timing, sequencing, and certainly strategic communications. I think you would see, an Ashkenazi or a Gantz or Lapid be more digestible to the American, the center left or the left wing of the American polity than Bibi is, for all the obvious reasons to all of you. But I don't see much fundamental difference between these people, these parties, on the key national security issues that face Israel. Now, on economic issues, on social issues, huge differences. And that's why Israeli elections are fundamentally fought on domestic issues, not on security issues.
Okay, great. Well, that's going to be our last question. And I just want to thank you so much, Mark. And I also want to thank everybody for attending, and want to say happy Hanukkah to everybody, and to and Voice for Israel really appreciates your attending. Mike,
Mike,
I see you're on now.
Send my personal thanks to you. This was very informative, very exciting for us. I really appreciate your coming and talking to us.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me. And by the way, great questions. Very, very challenging. More challenging questions than I get in Washington. So kudos to your members. They're obviously very well informed.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you again
For having me. All the best.
Happy Hanukkah.
Bye.